Hey, I'm excited to share this with you. This is a radio show appearance, so no video, but a radio show appearance on my good friend David's radio show talking about antiques. Let's dive into this.
I set up at my first show when I was 14, selling baseball cards. I've owned an antique mall, sold online, set up at the cheapest flea markets, and some of the more expensive indoor walled antique shows. My name is Matt Gregg, and this is the life of a modern antique dealer.
Okay, so yeah, no video today. I'll share some still life photos and stuff looped over it, but mainly it's just audio. Dive in. Let's dive in. See how I did, and let me know how I did.
Greetings and welcome to another episode of Antiques Trail here on ICRV Radio. I'm your host, David Perrelli of Old Beautiful Antiques and Art in Clinton, Connecticut. It's never hard to check in on today's guest because he is a prolific vlogger with his own YouTube channel where he regularly posts video content documenting his travels, finds, and perspectives on the antiques business. He deals mainly in folk art, country Americana, and early glass, and often has an eye for the fun and offbeat. Aside from his online presence, he's also active on the show circuit, exhibiting all the way from the Mid-Atlantic region into New England and sometimes into the Midwest. I'm pleased to welcome by phone the Milton, Delaware-based antique dealer Matt Gregg of Matt Gregg Antiques. Matt, good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for making time to join me on the program today. So, this show has not aired since August, and I think a lot in the antiques world has happened since that time, namely Antiques Week in New Hampshire and also the latest edition of Brimfield, both of which I think you participated in. So how did those...
I set up at both and bought at both.
How did they go for you?
I was slightly disappointed with sales, probably at both, but I bought really well at both, so I think overall, definitely a positive experience for both of them for me.
What was your impression of, like the crowd size and the enthusiasm among the buyers there? Did it look good to you?
Definitely looked good. I think, my understanding was that New Hampshire was down a little bit in terms of overall crowd size, and I don't know. Obviously, promoters care, I think, more about just the gate than dealers do, and we're probably more concerned with active buyers. And so I don't know, if the crowd was down 20%, I don't know if the really selective active buyers was also down 20% or if they were still there. But it did seem like the gate was down a little bit, but definitely a lot of enthusiasm on the floor for sure at both events.
Yes, everyone is kind of keeping an eye on what's going on in shows in the immediate aftermath of the lockdown, just to try and figure out, what that portends for the future. But as I mentioned a moment ago in the introduction, you are what's known as a vlogger, which I think means video blogger. And you're not the first guest on the show to make use of this medium, but I think you have definitely used it to a greater extent than any other. And I thought I would start out by asking you what appeals to you about this medium and why did you choose it as opposed to, say, a traditional blog or something else? Well,
so I've told people for years, probably starting in my late 20s, that if I had a chance to do college over again, I probably would have done film studies or filmmaking or something like along that line, rather than the political science and history that I did study. And so it just was. Back in 2013, I made a documentary about a pipeline in Vermont, and completely unrelated to the antiques business. And so at the time, I made a couple of videos about my antique travels, and I wasn't even using YouTube. I was using Vimeo at the time, but I got away from it. And then I guess it was probably 2 years later, I decided I really needed to start. Maybe 3 years later, just doing the videos as a chance to not only sort of promote the antique business, but also practice, I guess, video making in some regard. Although it's much more difficult to film yourself than it is to film someone else. But yeah, I guess I think certainly what I deal in, but probably what pretty much everyone deals in. It's very much a visual medium, and so the antique. So I think that's where YouTube, or kind of is better than just a typical blog where you're using photos only. A video can kind of present the object, from multiple angles and multiple sides.
Tell us a little bit about your documentary.
Sure. So that actually came about because of another antique dealer, Jeff and Holly Nordsey, out of Vermont, and it was a pipeline, a proposed pipeline going through and around their town, and I made the documentary more as to show the emotions of the landowners affected, not so much telling about the pipeline itself, but I think it accomplished that. I think I was able to, portray that in an accurate light, how they felt about it, more so than just, this is happening. And but yeah, I just went up there and I filmed it over a course of like 3 days, and then I edited it for a while at the house, of course, because it's one of those things where any documentary is way more footage than what ends up being in the final product.
So what happened? Did the pipeline end up getting built?
It did, but in a different manner than I think they initially were proposing. So unfortunately for a few of the people in the video, their property was greatly impacted, and what they would consider a very negative manner.
So you alluded to this briefly a second ago, but I wanted to ask you about your process for making one of your videos. And incidentally, anyone who wants to look at one, all you have to do is go to YouTube and type in Matt Gregg Antiques, and his YouTube channel will come up. And there are quite a few videos there for you to view. But
I've been slacking recently, and I've actually probably over the next 5-6 weeks will put out a video each week, if not more. But I do kind of two different, style videos. One will be like the long form, kind of looking at a show as an entirety, and those I think typically run like 10 to 15 minutes on YouTube. But it just, the amount of time it takes me to edit those, because that might end up being like 200 little mini clips or shots cut together. And then I'll do little other videos where I just sit and talk about a single object, or maybe 2 or 3 objects I just got, or tell like an antique story. And those are a lot shorter, typically like 2 to 5 minutes long, sometimes even more like 2 to 3 minutes long. And those take me a lot less time to edit and put together, but they seem to do not do as well in terms of views and comments and everything on YouTube. So it's kind of a struggle as to whether I want to put out just the long form ones, I guess I call it, or the short ones. But the short ones are much easier to crank out and kind of keep consistently putting up.
Do you get a lot of engagement and feedback from people on YouTube? Is there kind of like an antiques community on there?
So there's definitely a community of people who kind of follow the accounts of people who I think would describe themselves more as pickers, and like they might show themselves going to flea market, or they show how to flip stuff on eBay. As far as the more the antiques that we deal in and the people we know, there's definitely a much smaller community. I get a fair bit of trolling going on, which is always interesting, but I get a lot of engagement in person over the videos, and people who watch them but don't necessarily, comment on YouTube, probably don't even have a YouTube account, but they watch the videos. And I constantly have people coming up to me who know me, know what I look like, know what I sound like, and I, of course, have no idea who these people are, because either I haven't met them or I just know them as a username. And often people's usernames, like on Instagram, might not even be their profile. A profile picture might not be of them; it might be of an object. And so it's kind of interesting how many people, even at Brimstone, I think I had 5 or 6 people come up to me who knew me, and felt like they really knew me because they've watched so many videos. And it takes a second or two before I even know who they are. But I always enjoy that.
I think I had the easiest time preparing for this interview of almost any other on here, because there was such a wealth of material that was easily accessible to generate questions and points of discussion. So that was
I definitely put a lot out there.
Let's backtrack a bit, and why don't you tell us how you originally got interested in antiques and what your early exposure was to them?
I feel like it's, everyone's story is different, but there's a real common theme in that we got into it because of our parents. It seems like a bulk of dealers. Parents were dealers, or parents were hardcore collectors. And my mom did a few shows when I was younger, when I was like 6, 7, 8 years old, and then she had a shop for a while through high school and the beginning of college. And I was a hardcore baseball card collector, like pretty much every kid in the mid-'80s, And I started selling doubles even as young as maybe like 8 or 9 at some of the shows with her. And when she had a shop when I was in high school and beginning of college, I had like a showcase in the shop and had baseball cards and then later comic books. And it sort of just grew from there, I guess, would be the simple solution, but, or the simple story. But yeah, I ended up, after college, I was looking for something to do. I was trying to open my own shop. My parents had retired to Delaware at that point. I didn't grow up in Delaware, and I followed them down there, and my mom had some stuff in antique malls, and again, I had some stuff in those antique malls as well in her booth, and then one of them was going to close, and so I just sort of took it over. And so I was 24, I guess, and I owned like an 8,000 square foot antique mall.
I'm glad you brought up antique malls because I feel like this is a type of selling that has not really been discussed on this program so far to any great extent, but it's one of the most popular types of antique shop. Can you just briefly tell our listeners what an antique mall is and how it works?
Sure. So an antique mall, it's typically a bigger kind of building. You will see a lot of like old Kmart or something converted into antique malls. But like I said, mine was, I guess, 8,500 square feet of space inside. And I owned the business, and then I would rent out little sections, usually like a 10 by 10 or 10 by 15 spot at a price per month per square foot, usually. And then the vendors would fill it with their own stuff. They would price their own stuff. They're responsible for buying their merchandise and pricing it, bringing it in, displaying it, and then they leave it, and the store owner and workers sell it for them on their behalf. And so my particular mall, I think I had a lot of space in there myself, but I probably had maybe 30, 40 dealers at one point. And so, yeah, they would pay me a monthly rent, and then I, of course, would maintain the rent on the shop itself and advertise the shop itself and keep the electricity on and all that kind of stuff, and then sell it for them.
That sounds like a pretty big and complicated enterprise to have to manage. What were some of the challenges of doing that?
So, you have basically, as an antique mall owner, you have sort of two levels of customers. You have the dealers you rent to who are paying you, you can say $100, $150, $250 per month for that little bit of space in your shop. And then you have the people who walk in, the customers who walk in and buy the stuff. And so it's sort of, you want to keep both sets happy, but it's, so you have to, and then the dealers you see, the dealers who are successful come in at least once a month and rearrange and bring new stuff in. And so you see those people on a fairly regular basis. And like I said, they're paying you what seems like a lot of money. So you want to keep them happy, and then you also have to, I think that was the trickiest thing, was some of the dealers, and I think every antique mall would tell you this, some of the dealers are difficult to deal with. And probably the same promoters feel the same way about show dealers, that some of us are more difficult than others. And so, you're trying to keep everyone happy and the ship moving forward as easy as possible, I think.
So I take it you no longer have this place. What prompted you to give it up?
Well, at the time, I was pretty irritated, but my landlord kicked me out. He wanted to do bigger and better things with the building, and so he ended up just giving me notice and kicking me out. And at the time, it was like I had a lot of space in there myself. I had, 1,500, 2,000 square foot of space in there filled with my stuff, plus some of the stuff in storage, and it just took it was a lot of work moving it all out, storing it, figuring out what to do with it. But yeah, I think at the time, like I said, it was very irritating and upsetting, but it turns out to be a blessing, because now I moved on to doing shows, and then I also sell online, like you mentioned, and then I actually rent spaces in 2 different antique malls now.
Just viewing this from the other side of the coin, so to speak, what are some of the keys to being a successful seller in an antique mall?
So that's my most popular YouTube video of all time. I made a YouTube video about that. That's probably, I think it's like 4,000 views or something. I haven't looked recently. But the key to selling anywhere, of course, is knowing sort of your audience and price point. Like, different malls sort of have like a different feel to them. Some of them might be a little more decorative, and some of them might be more true antiques, or some of them might be more collectibles. And so you have to make sure your merch sort of fits with the people walking in, and then the price point, you have to make sure it's not way overpriced. And of course, there's displaying it. But I think what a lot of antique mall dealers, how they screw up is they don't turn the booth over enough. It's surprising how many customers come in every month. Some more often than that, but a lot of them come in monthly or every other month. And so if your booth looks the same year after year, it's really hard to sell from. So you got to completely rearrange your booth. You have to bring in new stuff. Take out some stuff if it's sat for a while. Take it out, take it home. If you have a spot in a different antique, I think one key is if you have a spot in a second antique mall, you can kind of move the merch back and forth a little bit, which will help keep it looking fresher. But I think that's the real key, is to rearrange your booth as often as possible.
Do you miss having a shop? Any plans to possibly go back to doing that at some point in the future?
No. I had for a couple years, John Chasky and I had a little shop together after my big antique mall closed. And I enjoyed that because it was just his and my stuff, and we sort of alternated working days. And it was really small, but there can be good money in owning an antique mall, I guess, if you get into the property right. I know I drive through certain areas on my travels, and you see a ton of them. Down like 81, for instance, in Virginia, there's a couple that are just huge. They're so big, they have like little cafes that serve food, I guess, because people are going to be there so long, they don't want them to leave when they get hungry. But and those places are packed, so they must be making pretty good money. But I just, it's a lot of work, and it prevents you from focusing as much on finding the way to make it, I think, most profitable as an owner is to work there yourself. And then if you're working there yourself, you're not out buying antiques to resell yourself. And so, yeah, it's a different style of work, and I kind of prefer finding fun and interesting things myself rather than selling other people's.
I noticed, based on a lot of your Instagram posts and elsewhere, that you seem to like to deal in old signs a lot, which appear to be quite popular in the market right now. Why do you think they are so popular, and why do you like signs so much?
So particularly metal signs, production signs. I mean, there's no question that a show like American Pickers made them more popular. They were already popular. They were one of the things that, like, in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, did not sort of go down when the rest of the market did. But then when the American Picker show took off, that was one of the things that they were sort of hunting for themselves, was advertising. And it just seems like everyone started collecting advertising who didn't already collect it. And, you know, there was a bigger demand for lower grade kind of signs. And so I definitely started with that, like the Coke signs, and I still like Coke signs and production signs, but I try to buy more hand-painted, you know, 1 of 1 or like 1 of 5 wood signs, or even if they're metal, the hand-painted kind of folky ones myself. But sometimes tend to be earlier, not necessarily, you know, porcelain signs can date to the early. There's a lot of metal signs that date to the early 1900s. But, yeah, so I think the wood signs sort of are the best of both worlds, in that they can be folk art, certainly, and they can be somewhat rare, you know, 1 of 1 or 1 of 5, or however many signs that business had painted. And so they can, you know, appeal to, like, the true purist antique collector, but also a person who likes advertising and might even buy a lot more newer advertising than a true antique collector might consider.
So what's the last year and a half been like for you? Obviously, you are a show dealer, so shows weren't happening, and that was a problem for many dealers. But at the same time, you sell a great deal online. Was business okay for you?
So actually, last year was my best year in like 5 years, which seems crazy. When I was panicked when this first started happening, the Nashville show was in February. That was I had a good show. It was a profitable show. I actually did less cash flow than I would have thought, because as you know, sometimes at a show you might sell something at cost or close to cost, and so you might generate a lot more cash flow. That was a show where I didn't generate a ton of cash flow, but I sold stuff that was profitable, and so I had a profitable show, but cash flow wise it was down a couple grand from the year before. And then right before, the last show I did was a bottle show right before everything started shutting down, and that was the worst of that particular bottle show had ever been for me. So, like, shows are shutting down. When the NBA decided to cancel the rest of the season, I thought, okay, like, antiques are not going to be, no one's going to be buying antiques. And so I was panicked. My checking account was hurting. So I sold a couple of things out of my personal collection at kind of a loss just to make sure I had enough money to cover it. And then it was weird. I just started posting a lot more stuff on Instagram, and I started listing a lot more stuff on eBay. At the time, I probably only had like 25 listings on eBay, and now I'm up to like 200. I started an Etsy page or an Etsy account, and just that stuff was just eBay and Instagram and Etsy were just selling really well for me. At one point, I was just like, okay, I don't even need shows as much as I used to. Yes. And of course, as you know, shows can be pricey to do, and so when a show goes poorly, it can go very poorly and be a big loss. And so by not doing shows, I eliminated the shows where I was losing money, and then selling on eBay. Obviously, they take a percentage, but there's not the upfront cost of setting up at a show.
What do you see, in your opinion, what do you think the biggest challenges are going to be facing or for antique dealers in the future? I mean, I asked you ahead of time if there was anything on that you especially wanted to talk about on the show, and you mentioned that we need to find a way to save the antiques business. And this is a topic that has been discussed, I think, with practically every guest that's ever come on this program, because there's no doubt that the market has changed quite a lot, even in the last 10 years or so. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So, of course, you failed to mention that that was clearly a joke on my part, that the two young dealers were going to try to save the business, or younger dealers. But the biggest difference is how people collect now. It used to be that if you were a collector and you collected mocha, or you collected yellowware bowls, or you collected whatever, you went sort of one of every example. And so if you went to a show and you saw the yellowware bowl that had 3 stripes, 3 blue stripes, and 1 yellow stripe or something, like, oh my God, I don't have that version, like, you sort of just bought it. Or if you thought it was reasonable enough, you bought it. And the next thing you know, if you're a yellowware collector, you might have 75 or 100 yellowware bowls. Or a mocha collector, you have 3 or 4 cupboards full of them, you have them overflowing, you're boxing them up in the attic. And so, as a dealer, that sort of, if you knew what the rare pieces were, you were always able to sell them because you knew collectors wanted the rare pieces. They had the common stuff. And then you hope for new collectors to come along who would buy the more common stuff and who would, gradually turn into collectors of the super rare and paid top dollar for the rare mocha or the rare yellowware or the rare bottles or whatever it was that they collected. And of course, I think the big difference with the business now is that people don't collect like that anymore. If they like yellowware bowls, they want 5 to put up in their kitchen, but they only want 5. They don't need 75. And the same with mocha. They might they want a few pieces that look really nice, and they don't need to have every single piece that they've ever seen. And I'm thinking more of, say, people under the age of 40 who are collecting the stuff. They're buying more for the look than they are to have one of every kind of example. And so there are definitely younger collectors who appreciate the old stuff and who want period examples and want, the best or the best they can afford, but they don't want, like I said, they don't want to have 1,000 of them or 500 of them, whether it's bottles or mocha or something else. And so I think that's the biggest difference is that we can't rely on the volume collectors anymore. There's definitely a push among younger people to have less stuff, not to have the house overflowing, to have more space in the house, and to have the stuff sort of breathe more. And I think that's sort of one of the big differences. And certainly every older dealer complains that not enough young people collect, but I see young people who do collect, but they don't necessarily have the disposable income that maybe younger collectors did 30 years ago. And so that's sort of a generational economic issue that we are at the mercy of, that we can't really fix ourselves. But I think we need to realize too, as dealers moving forward, like, people, I think younger buyers want more of a look than they do just the bulk of stuff. So I think that's something we need to consider as dealers.
Yeah, I definitely see evidence for all of that in my own shop in business. But we are out of time for today. The half hour has flown by, and
oh, wow, that was quick.
Yeah, I want to thank you for making the time to join me today and sharing your insights into the antiques business. And again, go over to YouTube and type in Matt Gregg, Greig Antiques, and check out Matt's YouTube channel. There's lots of interesting content there.
Great. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for watching, or listening, I guess. I hope you enjoyed it. To catch more of my content, hit like and subscribe. Check me out. Again, thanks for listening.